Hello and welcome to Counterculture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, over the past few weeks, we've seen 3 demonstrations in London which are protesting about the lockdown and indeed the removal of civil liberties. Is this a real thing? Are we in fact seeing the gradual erosion of centuries worth of civil liberties, or is this an overreaction? In fact, should we in fact give up some of those liberties in the face of this pandemic? Now, with me to discuss this today, I'm very pleased we have 4 guests. First of all, Marc Sidwell, who is the author of the New Culture Forum book, The Long March. Nigel Jones, historian and author. Dr. Kevin Corbett, who's a health scientist and retired nurse of 36 years standing. And the New Culture Forum's Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, historian and commentator. Thank you for joining us. Can I ask, first of all, as I did in the title there, are we basically seeing our civil liberties being eroded in a way that means that they are gone forever, Nigel?
Could be. They're certainly being eroded, and they could be gone forever. But I think once governments take a modicum of power, they're very reluctant to release it again. And I think that's the big danger, that all these restrictions and rules have been imposed without parliamentary consent largely. They've been nodded through because Parliament was absent because of the pandemic. And I don't know when they're going to be given back to us. And I think that's the big danger.
Would you agree with that, Marc?
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic saying, isn't it, that there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government programme. The famous example might be like the pub restrictions that were put in place in 1914 to aid the war effort in World War I, not repealed until the 1980s. So whatever you think in the short term about the new curfew, the 10 p.m. Closing time for pubs, even if it's a good idea in the short term, that doesn't mean that it's easy to get rid of. And this general concern, I think, that I have, I have some sympathy for the need for the emergency action, but that everything seems to have been done not on a sort of emergency basis with sunset clauses in a real sense that this is just temporary and we're going to get back to a more liberal society, but simply on the basis that we might need this for forever, or just until we come up with a system of repeal, and none of that's built in, and that is a real reason for concern, even if you think in the short term that this is worth doing.
Kevin, have you been surprised at basically how compliant people have been?
Extremely concerned about it, and as somebody who's been involved in 2 of those protests in London over the last couple of months, you can see at a granular level what we've just said, in terms of the removal of rights and freedoms on the basis of quite a hysterical response to what we're told is a public health issue. And at a granular level, you can see also the arbitrary nature of this as it impacts. For example, the BLM demonstrated all the way through the summer, and the police knelt to them in London. And the 2 protests that I was involved in, the police didn't kneel to us. They were actually sent in to do baton charges against peaceful protests.
We saw this particularly with the last one, didn't we?
Yes. And that was the last one that was coordinated by Louise Crefeld and Piers Corbyn on the 26th. The one I was involved in as a speaker, as an invited speaker on the 19th, the TSG, the Terrorist Patrol Support Group, which is the riot police, were sent in to clear people. And these were people that were there. They were advised about social distancing. There had been a risk assessment. All the requirements had been carried out. And yet it was disproportionate response. And when you see that at a grassroots level, you can understand what's happening, And these were doctors, nurses talking to the public. And the question you have to ask is, okay, that we're told there's a public health emergency, the public can see the flaws in the science from a very grassroots level. They see the tests have no accuracy, they see the track and trace doesn't work, they see QR codes being forced on them through trading standards. which will be used to shut their businesses and stop their income. So at a very basic level, this has got to add up for people, you know, and people may have become compliant very quickly because of the globalist mantra, the globalist nature of the emergency. But at a grassroots level now, I think you're finding people are pushing back, and people are realising that a lot of things don't add up about the science and the tests, and that what they've been told is not necessarily the truth. For example, the situation in the nursing homes. We heard a lot about the tests not being done and people being pushed into nursing homes from the hospital acute sector. What we didn't hear about was what the Queen's Nursing Institute came out with a few weeks ago, which is the results of a survey that showed that people, whole groups of people, and I'm quoting here, were coded not for resuscitation on the basis of advice from hospitals and clinical commissioning groups. So patients and residents were coded not for resuscitation, not through negotiation with their clinicians, which is the normal way of doing things, but through diktat from faceless bureaucrats. And that's quite concerning. And that was a report by Professor Alison Leary from South Bank University, who's Professor of Community Nursing, and it was commissioned by the Queen's Nursing Institute, which is not a conspiratorial organisation. It is a very, very credible research organisation for community nursing. So when the public were coming up to me at rallies up and down the country for the last couple of months saying to me, Kevin, my mother had a form put in front of her in the nursing home and she's told to sign it, which coded her not for resuscitation. We were concerned that nobody picked up the phone to us. It wasn't a decision that was negotiated with the doctor or nurse. It's something that came down from above. And now we have evidence of that in this report. And it's those sorts of things, Peter, that people are very concerned about.
Rafe, do you think that civil liberties, the implication being ancient ones actually, have really been affected, or do you think this is hyperbole?
It's not hyperbole at all. History shows us that liberty is lost not always at the hands of a tyrant, but through well-intentioned measures, albeit misplaced measures. And there's this gentle and gradual erosion that we're seeing. And we know full well from history that institutions, as we've seen with the Supreme Court, once institutions acquire power, they want to acquire more power, even if they don't intend to do so. And certainly in terms of this government, that's precisely what we've seen. And, you know, history has also shown us, as you've just said, one of the benefits of being a historian is you can actually look at things in perspective and take a broader picture and put things into context. And so in terms of global pandemics throughout history, this is perhaps the mildest we have ever seen, and yet we're employing and engaging the most extreme measures that we've ever seen. We're talking about measures which even in wartime we haven't seen. Why? In order solely to protect people who are essentially above 65 or above 70 with comorbidities, that the entire population has now got to suffer the same sorts of shielding protections. And it is a case that this is being affected through fear without any scientific justification. It's the policy of fear that has been basically causing the British public to acquiesce into this, because, as you said, there has to be justification for these policies. And as we've seen, the government may say that it's following the science, but it's not following the science.
Well, you know, I think it's important when we look at this that we try and steel-man the arguments. You know, we try and say what's the the best argument for the other side. And you know, I am deeply concerned about what might be the long-term implications of the changes in this sort of liberties. I mean, I remember it's not that long ago that the idea of, a traditional idea of the government stays out of people's bedrooms was a sort of basic idea of liberalism, and now suddenly casual sex or outside an established relationship, Hancock is telling us it's illegal. These are bizarre times in those ways, for very normal everyday liberties. But at the same time, it's not entirely uncontroversial to say that this is a very mild pandemic, and it's worth saying, what do we do if there are real dangers here? Not the same dangers as might have been if it was the Black Death or if it was a more severe one, but given that large numbers of people potentially could still die at a population level, given that it's very, very hard to shield these vulnerable populations, given that large numbers of the population come into contact with them, or if they're younger. So I'm just saying, it's important that we don't just, because we care about the liberties, give ourselves an easy time on thinking about the disease.
But Marc, we discussed this in April, and in April I made the very same argument that we have to actually balance lives with quality of life, which now people are calling livelihoods, but back then I called it quality of life. And also, people dying from other diseases, be it cancer, be it heart disease and stroke, heart attacks rather, people being too scared to present themselves. And, hospitals know full well the policies of triaging, right? Triaging is making a choice as to who is actually going to merit certain medical interventions, and unfortunately we have a government following feelings rather than facts, and we're at a point where actually the nation needs to consider triaging the nation and realizing there are consequences at play here. And as I said again in April, it's the old philosophical argument of the trolley, the trolley quandary. If you have a trolley going down the tracks and you have the ability to divert the track to save one person, but by doing so it may kill other people, what do you do? And unfortunately, my view then was that we have made the wrong decision, and I think, unfortunately, that, the past few months are now bearing that out.
Well, I think you make a good point there, but I mean, to qualify it a little bit more, I'd say that the issue about triage and what doctors call the differential diagnosis when somebody presents to hospital with symptoms is key to this. And we've had mislabeling of people as COVID cases who have a set of generic symptoms that could be hundreds of different things. And because of the tsunami of propaganda that went ahead of this whole hysterical approach to COVID, doctors and nurses themselves have become victims, perhaps, or infected with, perhaps that's the wrong word, this propaganda. So they interpret a set of generic symptoms which the government says is COVID as COVID before they even have a test. And therefore people have been labelled as COVID and fast-tracked down the pathway of ventilation. And we know where that ended up.
Marc, but if I remember when we discussed it before, you wouldn't necessarily have thought it was hysterical, would you? You were a little bit more nuanced in your attitude to the disease, to the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think even though we know much more about it now, it still seems to me that if you look at the numbers and if you're trying to make these decisions under tremendous uncertainty, potentially still it's not implausible that very large numbers of people could die this winter of COVID, in amongst all of the mislabeling and so forth. This is a very serious disease for certain people. We do have large enough numbers of those people in the UK. If we don't get lucky on T-cell immunity and things like that, if we don't get lucky on a low level of herd immunity, there's plenty of people who could still get it and it could still kill them, who are going to be in hospital for a very long time even if they don't. These are serious effects to worry about. The organ damage, long COVID in the young and healthy. So I think there are real problems there, and you do have to balance that. And simply the fact that we just don't know the answers and it's moving all the time. And you have to act early. In the nature of pandemics, you have to act before you have the information, before all the cases are there. Or you have what we had the first time round, where Boris waited to act.
But is it really a pandemic? With the global statistic is something like a 99% recovery rate. I
think these are just games with words. If there's a new virus to which most people don't have any immunity, which is spreading around the world, potentially at exponential rates, and that can kill large numbers of people, and has been declared a pandemic by the WHO, who, I have my own problems with, but at least that's one definition of it. We can play games with words, but that's a pandemic on most normal.
Well, WHO didn't declare it a pandemic initially, I remember and there was a lot of uncertainty over that. And people die every year from flu. Yeah. I mean, where's the flu epidemic this year? Have you thought about that? Every year is a flu epidemic, and lots of people die, older people die. Everybody who's worked in the NHS, and I've worked in it for 36 years, know about flu epidemics. And yet the numbers were greater in previous years when you add them up. Not just flu, but bronchopneumonia and other chest conditions, which would really dwarf this COVID pandemic into a nutshell, really, when you look at it in the global
So, do you know, I mean, that's an interesting point, but what seems to be happening here is basically judging whether this is a pandemic or not. Is there a definite connection between one's concern about civil liberties and your scepticism or not about the pandemic? That's the point. You can actually believe in the fact there's a pandemic, but actually be surely very concerned about, you know, the what seems to be arbitrary imposition of various restrictions.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say no?
Well, I would say that. And my concerns as a historian, as Rafe said, you know, being a historian, you do get to look back at certain crises that have happened before. And the obvious ones are the two world wars and the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918-19, which is probably the most recent pandemic on the scale of COVID. It was much, much worse than COVID. 50 million people across the world died of it, 20 million in Europe alone. But there was nothing like these measures. People did wear masks. There was a lot of disinfecting of public transport, buses and so on in those days. But we recovered very, very quickly. I mean, there's been hundreds and thousands of books written on the First World War. There's been about 10 written on the pandemic, which killed 3 times more or 4 times more people than the war. And that gives you an idea. So I do think we have overreacted to this, because even in a worst case scenario, COVID is going to be nothing like the scale of the Spanish flu. And we recovered from that within 2-3 years after, in the early 20s. So what really concerns me is the fact that we had a war cabinet in both world wars, a very small number of people conducting a world war. We now have a very, very small number of people, possibly even smaller than Churchill's and Lloyd George's war cabinets, conducting the war against COVID. And that does worry me, that the government is taking its advice from a very small group of scientists whose scientific advice is contested. But they're also hiding it not only from the public, the reasons for what they're doing, they're hiding it from Parliament as well, which is, if we are a democratic society, that is where it should be discussed and thrashed out, and it hasn't been. And that is gravely worrying.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, look, you know, there's been Brexit, and there's been the campaign for Brexit and the sovereignty of Parliament. And what has actually been extraordinary about this is that Parliament seems entirely irrelevant, and no one's really protesting about it, on left or right.
Well, it's quite perverse, isn't it? We've gone from a situation a few months ago where Parliament was thwarting the democratic will of the people that the government was trying to install, to now we've got the opposite situation where the government is acting irrespective of the wishes of Parliament to hold government to account. So it's an extremely perverse dichotomy here. But speaking of dichotomy, I also think there's a false dichotomy being set up here in terms of it's a question of liberty to the point of letting coronavirus rip through society without any checks at all. I don't think anyone is saying that. So it's not a question of basically having, you know, liberty or death quite literally in that context. We look at the Asian flu of 56, 57, and you look at America particularly under Eisenhower, a very comparable situation, and far worse in many respects. Nothing like we had no lockdown at all. The economy was able to bounce back and so forth. You know, scientists at the time in Sweden were saying, look, the 3 basic things are wash your hands, keep social distance. I mean, that's basically all that you need to do. And that was the policy. We have to remember, Britain was embarked upon a similar policy to Sweden. And the Swedes were really encouraged by the fact that they weren't going to be the only ones going down this radical path. They were so heartened by the fact that we were coming along with them. And Chris Whitty, if you remember, originally had said, this is going to be mild effects for most people who will get over it. The people who needed to be cocooned were those people who were over 70. The rest of society should go about their business. And it was only when you had the mention of herd immunity and you had this panic in the media and this outrage in the media, followed by Neil Ferguson's ridiculous notions of 500,000 dead in the Imperial College modelling, that the government panicked and changed course. And of course they believed for some reason that the Brits wouldn't actually be following any lockdown. They expected that there would only be about a 70% or so adherence to the lockdown, and so they exaggerated beyond belief with this fear system, and they used their effective slogans. You know, we had take back control, we had let's get Brexit done, and then they put in this new slogan about the lockdown, and it worked too much. And once you've instilled fear in people, it's very hard then to backtrack and say, actually, we weren't really that serious, it wasn't that bad. And to save their own backs, they haven't been able to admit that. And so this lockdown that only was put into place for one reason, to flatten the curve, not to stop a single death. We were told it was simply to enable the NHS to gather its resources, build up these hospitals, which had space for 4,000 people in the Nightingale Hospital here, only had 60 patients in any bedrooms, and yet after that we're told that no, the parameters have changed and they couldn't backtrack on the fear quota.
But you see, therefore, I mean, people watching this or watching the news will be thinking, you know, these ridiculous figures that you mention from Neil Ferguson, the fact that when he's done this before for other pandemics, have been equally bad. Why Why are they taking notice again? Will you explain to me why are they?
Particularly as Neil Ferguson himself promptly flouted the rules that he had recommended for his own nefarious purposes, going and screwing another man's wife. But that is part of what I was saying. That the terrible mistake is to take this advice from such a small group of people who had a dubious previous record, because Neil Ferguson's record, foot and mouth, all the other things that he got so hopelessly wrong, why did the government then do a U-turn and change its policy, which had been, as Rafe said, following the Swedes, on the say-so of this man? It's absurd, it's mad.
Have you been surprised? We're talking about civil liberties, remember? I take that as well to be freedom of assembly, you know, the Englishman's home is his castle, all of this sort of thing. One characteristic of the British and the English was always a kind of truculence about freedom and not just simply going under the cosh, you know. I haven't seen that much of that characteristic around this time. No. Would you say?
Well, I mean, Boris did actually mention it when he did his broadcast the other week, and he said, well, we're a freedom-loving people, and that's why we've had some difficulty. We haven't behaved, maybe Europeans would have been more tractable. So from his point of view, he has at least referenced that. I thought was something. I mean, something that is worth saying, because obviously it's somewhat against the spirit around this particular table, and I suspect among those listening too, but there is vast support in the country for these measures. And you can call it fear, but I mean, these are people thinking for themselves and able to access the evidence. And so I wouldn't be that dismissive about it. There is a vast majority in the British people to follow these measures. Now, I think they may not be that well informed on what the long-term economic consequences are, maybe on what the long-term prospects are for getting traditional liberties back out of that. But for the moment, at least, that is there, and it has to be considered as well. We can't just say this is just sort of the government versus the public or the people. The public are behind these measures in considerable
force. Well, that's hardly
force.
surprising because of the vast propaganda campaign that happened at the beginning to terrify and scare people. And as someone said...
Hang on. Yes, that's true. But hang on, we sort of can't have our cake and eat it on the polls. I mean, first of all, it's true. It's something like 63% of people.
Higher, I think.
Higher. And indeed, some people want even tougher cuts within that. We managed not to get frightened by Project Fear with the referendum campaign, did we not? Mm-hmm. So therefore, you know, I mean, how do you account for this compliance?
But it's worth remembering that Britons are statistically the most scared people in Europe, if not the world. And that's what I think
about COVID,
and that is because of the Fear Project. And but the reason the Fear Project was installed was because Boris Johnson did believe that we were a nation of liberty lovers, and that unless there was the fear of God put into us, that we would actually resist all of this. He was proved wrong, and then the fear had adverse effects. But there was that policy. But of course, and you're quite right. Johnson did say recently, it's because we're an independent, liberty-loving people that we have got worse results than Germany. But then to use that logic, Spain is a much more liberty-loving place than we are. So I'm not really quite sure.
No, but the point being is that, I mean, we were all of us probably involved in some way in the Brexit campaign or something. I mean, the fact is, from every single angle of our establishment, every single one, was saying this is going to be, well, World War III, actually, at one point. And yet people still had the guts. I mean, that's why people are so inspired to go against that. Why are they not having the guts this time? Is it because it's about death?
Well, I think one point that's been raised is the word establishment, and also the mainstream media, and the way the government put this information out in a very propagandist way. And you had really saturation coverage in the media. It was, you could actually look at the medical officer every 5 minutes on the TV with that po face of him telling people that they're going to be dead, and so people responded to that, and people soaked that up, and they weren't exposed to alternative views on what was happening. And if you go up and down the country, I have to take issue really, there are alternatives. There are other groups organising in every town in this country, organising against the lockdown measures, meeting in private, sometimes subversively, really, undercover. So this is an alternative narrative that you don't hear in the mainstream.
Well, I think the real problem, in part, there wasn't so much about the government as the sheer lack of quality in the mainstream or the traditional media. I mean, they had the traditional lobby correspondents.
Yeah, not health correspondents.
They didn't know anything.
Yes,
they were interested in the political
yes.
stories, and that kind of suited the government, because why would they have effective people to question them? But that was a disaster.
And they weren't allowed to ask certain questions. For example, like the tests have no known accuracy. They have no gold standard, an independent method of verifying their effectiveness and their performance. And that's why there's so many false positives. And all these test positives you're getting now are inflated false positives. They're not people with symptoms. They're people who've tested positive. And that doesn't necessarily mean they have a virus. That means they've tested positive for all sorts of other reasons.
I do think that Project Fear at the moment is breaking down, actually, and I think this is particularly so with young people. I mean, I've got a 20-year-old daughter, second year at university, since she didn't have a first year because of COVID, effectively. And her friends, and I just see it myself travelling around on trains. Okay, they're doing the mask wearing. They're minimal requirements. But basically, as we saw in the summer, they're assembling in great numbers for in the parks when it was so hot and so on, because young people have seen the statistics and they know that by and large they're not threatened by this disease. And therefore, I think the Project Fear and the compliance is beginning to crack and crumble.
One thing that's very important here is that we're talking very much in a British context, but when one says, oh, this is overstated and we're giving up liberties, as a result of it, the argument that comes back so often is, yes, but it's the whole world doing it.
Well, that's true. And I think, an approach to this is people are very happy to give up liberties if they understand the rationale for that and that it makes sense on a day-to-day level. But when they see inconsistencies, when they see the information's like a sieve that water goes right through, it doesn't make sense to ordinary people. They see, this scientist ignoring the information and going off with somebody's wife. They see this politician testing positive and travelling up and down the country. When they see that level of non-compliance from the experts and people that's supposed to be role modelling it, then of course it's going to undo all the good, inverted commas, that's been done. And at a basic level, people then become aware of, well, actually, why should I wear a mask? What is the evidence for masking? And when you look at the advice from the experts that convinced the government to promote masking, they said there is no good evidence, there's no randomised controlled trials that show masking works. So why should we be using it?
And it's actually the global example of erosion of civil liberties is another reason to be concerned, because there've been an international report put out showing that there are 80 countries around the world where this is happening in, and there's a great concern about how COVID is being used as a smokescreen in undemocratic regimes, in repressive regimes, to actually stamp down on the press, to limit liberties, to actually have a reason to actually not hold elections. People don't realise the laws in this country now permit the government to actually stop elections taking place as well, and to close down borders, and that's happening globally. So you even have, Greenpeace and Liberties speaking out about this erosion of civil liberties globally. This is not just some sort of right-wing conspiracy sort of thing. People on all levels are
conspiracies
concerned about it.
are a danger. I mean, I think one of the problems is, I think we could probably all agree, there are issues going on about civil liberties. There are, I would argue, at least some issues going on around the dangerousness of the virus that we should think about. But the problem is when people start to see these problems and they use the internet and they're trying to work it out for themselves, it can generate a tremendous negation, a sort of nihilism and paranoia, in which there are plenty of conspiracy theories out there that are nonsense that are being spread. And that can lead people towards a sort of reaction against any kind of sensible action. We could say that what's going on may be too much, an overreaction, but that doesn't mean there aren't things we should be doing. And there is a danger that a move to say, well, it's all rubbish and we all need to listen to all of the rumours on the internet and go against all of this means that we might throw everything out in the process.
Well, you talk about listening to rumours on the internet. The paper that developed the tests, the PCR test, from a sage scientist, Maria Zambon, who's head of the Public Health England's testing for PCR, for COVID, was a paper shared across all the European health agencies in January. So all the PHEs in each country contributed to developing the workflow methodology for the COVID PCR test. And in that paper, they used rumour to develop the test, because they went on the internet to find out whether the genetic sequence was a SARS-CoV sequence by looking at the internet in China. So they used rumour to develop the test. So when you talk about the public developing conspiracy theories and wild things from the internet, the scientists themselves use rumour to develop the test.
But that's my point. I'm not saying that the internet isn't a tool. The problem is that, as well as being a very valuable tool, it has all sorts of fringe nonsense that get talked as well, and that there is a danger that valuable things might be thrown out in the process, or paranoia might develop, and that can have all sorts of unforeseen consequences.
Well, I think the public's had a lot of paranoia and hysteria from the government and from the sage scientists. The corona hysteria, really.
Yeah, I think that what a lot of it comes down to, surely, is why. People say, well, if this is, if there are ulterior motives or something, what are they? If this is happening all over the world, you mentioned, elections, what actually is behind it then? I mean, we've heard of Bill Gates, we've heard of this, that, and the other. Why would this be so uniformly being done by most governments? What is behind it?
Who wants to be caught being wrong? Who wants to be the person who says, it's fine, we'll stand back, and then suddenly in 6 months, hundreds of thousands of people are dead? And that can be blamed on you if you're doing what everyone else is doing, safety in numbers. I mean, okay, it might be wrong, but Sweden got a lot of stick, right? And let's face it, the death count is very bad. If it does seem to have gone down or sort of moderated in cases, but that might change. But if Sweden had gone even worse, how much trouble would they be in?
I mean, this is a case is slightly going off the civil liberties thing, but that the hysteria seems to have taken hold, particularly in countries which no longer have very much of a religious framework, that actually don't really think very much about death.
Well, that's a good point, and I think that what the backdrop to this, the terrain on which the seeds have fallen, the terrain on which they've grown, is one where medicine and biomedicine has become secular science, and the position in which religion and spirituality had traditionally sat has gone. It's empty, and the position's been taken by biomedicine and people in white coats. I think partly this explains the government's response to SAGE and to Imperial College. And the paper that Imperial College published with the 500,000 projection, they said that they're only dealing with the projections. They're not looking at the ethical and economic impact of their projections. And as an academic, I would fail an undergraduate student in a dissertation who did not address the economic, the cost-effective issues with the science, the nursing science, the medical science that I was testing, that they were putting forward in their dissertation.
And on this same point, it's very true. We were told for the first 3 months that there was only the science, as if there was only the one true faith. And for the first three months, the media gave absolutely no exposure to contrarian scientists. Professor Carl Hennigan was only being touted by Peter Hitchens in March, April and May. Dr. Gupta from Oxford University, Professor Woolhouse, all of these learned authorities, and also in Sweden, not once were these people given platforms on the mainstream media, people who had actual clinicians' experience in this, and they were treated as if they were heathens,
yes.
Apostates.
And, in April, Carl Hennigan said, when you look at it overall, you look at the reality and not the model. The reality as it unfolds, it is an ILE, an influenza-like episode, on the back of an influenza-like episode, which we had every year. We had every year. Some are worse than others. And so this was a really very expert scientist saying this from Oxford University. And it just did not get picked up except for Toby Young in Lockdown Skeptics.
I think it's absolutely right what you were saying, Peter, about a society in which death has become the last enemy, the great unmentionable. I mean, the whole push of our medical science over the last, since the Second World War, has been to extend life, no matter what the quality of that life is. So you get people who, if left to nature, would have died. Their life is being prolonged, dementia-ridden people in old people's homes and so on. And therefore, I think a lot of the government's attitude towards it has been this: death is the great fear. We're a secular society. By and large, we don't believe in life after death or immortality or anything like that. We're terrified of death. Push it away. Extend life at all purposes. And I think that is the big Project Fear.
Also, surely, isn't it that we're terrified of death, we have no framework for death anymore, and also we trust emotions more than rational thought, don't we?
Yes.
I mean, it's all about how do you feel?
Yes.
How do you feel?
Yes, though I think that can probably go both ways. I think there's a lot of motivated reasoning on both sides, with people not wanting it to be true or fearing. In either case, there's a lot of generating of theories or supporting of theories that support their emotional state. But I think one of the interesting things is not quite about death, but it was the shock of the vulnerability, because everyone knew the pandemic at some point was coming in some form, but all of the thinking and the planning that went on about it assumed that the vulnerable were going to be in the megacities of Africa, of South Asia, and that we were in the West were going to be relatively okay. But actually it turns out that we had hidden vulnerabilities that we didn't even see. We didn't think about the huge numbers of people who are overweight, the huge numbers of people who are relatively old in our populations, and the very great difficulty of protecting those groups. So it was sort of out of nowhere, even for people who were thinking about these things ahead, that they suddenly looked around and thought, oh God, we're actually much more vulnerable to this than we thought we were going to be. And that was a shock even to people who were thinking ahead. Of course, that was in the early days when people were thinking it was much more dangerous potentially than it turned out to be, but even so.
But also it has shown the weaknesses in our apparently extraordinary economic prosperity, hasn't it? I mean, the speed with which London seems to have just collapsed is frightening, actually, is it not?
It is, and when you go into the City of London on a Monday and stand there at Bank Station above ground, and you can count on one hand people around you, when normally it'd be huge numbers. 350,000 people would come into the City of London every day, and there's less than 20% footfall.
Oh, yes.
And so the markets have collapsed, the housing markets that depend on the city have collapsed or collapsing. But I think, that aside, the economic impact, the profound way that this hysteria has taken hold, and I think the hysteria and the fear that goes with it, because I think they're a unit really that works together, and that perception, that the way fear and hysteria have impacted on our assessment of risk, is quite profound. So risks have been magnified. People die all the time in hospitals. People always do die in hospitals and nursing homes every year. And there's nothing unusual about that. And flu, influenza, chest infections always take people off. It's always the end stage in many diseases. And there's nothing different about that. But I think the way the risk has been magnified here has had a sinister appeal.
Yes, a sinister one indeed. And why I think this Project Fear has broadly worked, whereas the Brexit Project Fear didn't, is that even if you take the Remainers' worst example, Brexit is not going to kill you. But the suggestion is that COVID, certainly at the beginning, that COVID very likely will kill you. And that terrified people.
Also, I think maybe we shouldn't underestimate the fact that we are blighted by short-term merchants. The politicians are short-term merchants. Yes. As you say, they don't want to be seen to have blood on their hands. Whatever.
And it's the short-termism that actually is the other issue here, because it's not only sinister, it's perverse that people in the short term are trying to save the lives or extend the lives of people who would be dying within the next few years anyway, at the risk of actually having many, many more people die who have a quality of years of life ahead of them, of potentially decades, that they will now never get to enjoy.
Well, gentlemen, look, I think this one, as they say, is going to run and run. I think we're going to be talking about this for some time, certainly in the new year. How much it's going to change by then is anyone's guess. I've got my guess, but anyway. Thank you very much to Nigel, to Marc, to Rafe, and to Kevin. Do subscribe to Counterculture, won't you? And we will see you next week. Thank you.